Good morning, everyone. This is Himani Fatke. I'm the Research Director at SASB, and I'm joined here by David Parham. He's the Sector Analyst for Non-Renewable Resources. David will be doing most of the presentation on the non-renewable resources sector, and I will begin with a couple of introductory slides. So also, please feel free to ask questions at any point during the webinar. There is a screen for questions on your meeting invite, and then you'll be able to type in questions there throughout, and we'll take those and answer those towards the end. So we'll begin with a review of SASB's approach for those who may be less familiar with this, a refresher for those who've heard about SASB before. We'll talk then about the non-renewable resources sector and the specific standards that we've developed, and then finish off with the next steps in our standards development process, where we invite participation in improving the standards. So to review SASB's approach, let's begin with the basis on which we develop our standards. So we develop standards for material information on sustainability issues, such that public companies can report these to their investors. The definition of materiality that SASB uses in its work is that defined by the US Supreme Court as the disclosure of the omitted fact that would have been viewed by the reasonable investor as having significantly altered the total mix of information made available. So we're really focused on the reasonable investor and the total mix of information. The SEC further provides guidance to companies on what they should report in their management discussion and analysis section of the 10K. And that relates to the known trends and uncertainties that are reasonably likely to have a material effect on the financial condition or operating performance of companies. So we follow this definition in identifying sustainability disclosure topics and associated performance metrics. We understand that the materiality determination is at the company level, and the company decides what is material to report to its investors. SASB is essentially providing guidance for disclosure of material, decision useful, and cost-effective information to investors. Again, the standards are entirely voluntary, but this is a guidance for companies. So what we are providing is standardized presentation of this information such that you can compare one company with its peers and you can benchmark companies against each other. The determination of materiality is done at the level of our disclosure topics, where we identify whether a particular sustainability issue has the potential to affect value creation, is of interest to investors, and is actionable by companies. And it needs to be relevant across most of the companies in the industry for us to include it in the standards. The metrics also have their own criteria for selection, and they need to be comparable, complete, and verifiable, among other criteria. So the standards are developed and designed such that they can be reported in the Form 10K. So the Form 10K provides a true and fair representation of performance and material factors. It usually is signed off by the executives of the company. Often, of course, the financials are audited, and the MD&A disclosures can be assured as well. And that just provides a higher level of rigor in reporting the information around sustainability. And we provide the technical protocols and the guidance on exactly how certain metrics should be reported in the 10K. A quick overview of the evidence and the legal basis for materiality, the way in which we determine what topics are included in our standards. So there's an initial section where we assess materiality. We look at the evidence of interest. We surface issues based on that. Looking at what topics are discussed in terms of company or industry reporting. We then look for evidence of financial impact from each topic. So we systematically have documented evidence that ties a sustainability issue to financial impacts, and I'll get into that in a couple of slides. And this has been vetted through industry working groups and through public comment periods in developing our provisional standards. And to verify this, whether we've identified the right topics in every industry, We've also looked at what companies are reporting currently in their 10K in every industry and comparing that to what we've assessed as likely to be material for companies in that industry. So as I was mentioning, we looked systematically at the evidence of financial impact related to each issue. So we look at academic studies, industry reports, financial and environmental data to understand how each topic relates to a specific financial impact related to revenues, costs, assets or liabilities, and the cost of capital, or the risk premium associated with the company. So for example, I'll just take a couple of examples here. With water management, of course, there is an externality in resource scarcity, and we expect that in water-stressed regions, there'll either be a supply restriction or increasing costs of water. In terms of community relations for oil and gas or mining, of course, the reserves and the location in certain communities could be sensitive in terms of how those relations are managed. And if it's done poorly, it could potentially affect the operations of the company, leading to operational disruptions and affecting risk premiums. And of course, it could also affect assets and liabilities of assets of companies. So I'll hand over to David now to talk about the non-renewable resources sector and our specific changes that we're proposing for those standards.
Great. Thank you very much, Himani, for the excellent introduction, and thank you to everyone on the line for the opportunity to share some information with you this morning. And I'll just reiterate what Himani mentioned in that we really encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation. If you see anything in the material that you'd like to follow up on at the end of the presentation, please feel free to submit your questions at any time, and we'll be taking a look at those at the end of the presentation. So the non-renewable resources sector is made up of 8 specific industries, 4 of which relate to oil and gas, and those are exploration and production, midstream, refining and marketing, and services. And the other 4 which relate to extractive or mining-related businesses, including coal operations, iron and steel production, metals and mining, and construction materials. And so to the right, I've just shown a few pictures with some examples of some issues that are common themes to the sector as far as sustainability topics that are likely to be material. One, of course, is greenhouse gas emissions. It's not too surprising. The sector tends to be quite energy intensive in its operations, whether through the use of power or production of power, or fuel usage, for example, in mining. Another example of a topic that we see that's quite prevalent in all of these industries is water management, as Himani discussed in a couple of slides back. The sector is characterized by a high degree of interaction with water resources, whether through withdrawals and use in operation or discharges to water resources. And then the last topic that's quite common to these industries is health and safety. The sector is characterized, of course, by a high degree of potential hazards to employees. And so health and safety performance can have significant impacts on a company's ability to do business. So next I'd like to just present to you the industries that make up the sector and specifically some of the topics that are included in the standards for the different industries. So across the top of the slide you'll see the names of the different industries for which standards were developed in the sector. And along the left-hand side you'll see the general sustainability dimensions under which the specific topics are organized. So the first 4 industries we'll look at are the ones that make up the oil and gas industries. And a few cross-cutting themes that you can see here, as previously mentioned, were greenhouse gas emissions. And just one kind of thing to note on that, SASB had done some follow-up research on that, both in our climate bulletin as well as in a review of the intended nationally determined commitments submitted by the G20 nations for according to the Paris Agreement. And of course, the oil and gas sector is one of the most commonly mentioned sectors in those INDCs, which kind of shows the potential importance of greenhouse gas emissions to the industries in this area. Another cross-cutting issue, of course, water management, and in the oil and gas businesses, this primarily relates to water withdrawals for use in operations like hydraulic fracturing, for example. and disposal of water, whether produced water or other sources of wastewater. And then the last cross-cutting item that you can see is ethics, payments, and pricing transparency. And this relates both to competitive behavior in terms of prices charged or set for services or products, as well as potential exposure to liabilities in foreign countries, for example, according to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So these are just a few examples of some items that are common to these industries. And then looking at some other industries in the extractive sector, for metals and mining and related industries, you see energy management is quite common. The sector tends to be quite energy intensive in its operations. So different companies are exposed to different levels of risk based on their access to energy, the extent to which they've integrated renewable energy into their supply, and factors like this. And another aspect is community relations. Again, as Hamani alluded to earlier, this kind of relates to the perceived social benefit of operations in the locality, and it can be an important factor in the ongoing operation of existing facilities, or it can impact the potential development of new projects in those areas.
David, before we move on, I just wanted to check whether everyone can see the slides. If you can't, please type in the question box and let us know, but otherwise we'll continue.
Great. If we're having a technical issue, we'll sort it out, I'm sure. So this slide, now that we've kind of had a look at what topics are included in each of the sectors, we'd like to kind of present to you what the current disclosure looks like for each of the industries in the sector. So this chart shows SASB's analysis on the current state of disclosure by companies in the industry based on the SASB topic and the SEC filings, Form 10Ks or 20Fs. And to the left of the chart, the dark red shows where there's no disclosure currently identified in company filings. Moving to the right, the lighter red shows boilerplate disclosure, and then light gray industry specific, and darker gray the use of metrics. So one thing I'd like to point out is that overall, about 80% of the topics that SASB has identified as likely to be material for this sector are already being reported on in company filings. But a lot of this disclosure tends to be boilerplate or a narrative or not quantitative in nature. So it means that that disclosure is not as effective as it could be. And even where there are metrics that are used, often they're presented on a different basis, which makes it difficult to compare. So that emphasizes kind of what SASB sees as where we can add value, in that we're not so much changing what is being disclosed as we are seeking to improve the quality of the existing disclosure to make it more effective. So zooming in now on one specific industry that makes up the sector, now we're taking a look at the state of disclosure for the specific topics that make up the standard for the oil and gas exploration and production industry specifically. You'll see there's 10 topics in this sector, and each has its own associated metrics. And the current disclosure varies widely depending on the topic. One thing to note is that 6 of the 10 topics are actually already being reported on with the use of metrics, which is very good to see. To point out one in particular, HES performance is a topic that's being reported on to a high degree relative to others with the use of metrics. And that makes a lot of sense because, of course, the level of maturity of the tracking of this type of KPI within the industry. On the other end of the spectrum, you see the topic related to reserves valuation and capital expenditures, which relates to the impacts or potential impacts of future regulations that limit carbon emissions. And that one is not as well disclosed by the industry currently. And of course, the SASB standard offers a framework for companies to discuss that in their filings. So we'll dive a little deeper now into some examples within the provisional standards to help kind of visualize these topics. So this slide is meant to convey that, even for the same sustainability topic, the reporting metrics can vary across different industries within the sector. So in this case, I've pulled out the biodiversity impacts topic, and we've shown the associated metrics from the standards for the oil and gas exploration and production industry, oil and gas services industry, and metals and mining industry. So you'll see in the oil and gas E&P industry that the metrics focus on spills, and specifically highlighting spills in particularly environmentally sensitive areas. Moving to the oil and gas services sector, you'll see that the metric is focused on localized impacts associated with well development sites in terms of the disturbed acreage per development site. And then in metals and mining, this risk manifests itself through the potential for acid rock drainage and the associated mitigation or remediation activities being undertaken by a company to address that particular risk. So this is meant to convey the industry specificity that SASB takes when it's approaching our standards development process. And it highlights the channels through which a given topic have the potential to impact the financial performance of companies within that industry. So this slide is meant to kind of follow on to the previous one and exemplify in a little more detail how each topic was vetted, as Himani discussed earlier, to ensure that both aspects of the materiality assessment are present, the evidence of interest and the evidence of financial impact. So by way of example, this is a topic from the oil and gas exploration and production standard that I discussed a little bit earlier in the disclosure section about reserves valuation and capital expenditures. And it's seeking to quantify the impact on the hydrocarbon reserves valuation and returns on capital expenditures, considering the potential future impacts of various climate policies. So in this case, on the bottom left-hand side, there's that box that says evidence of interest. And this was based on our industry work group responses, which indicated about 79% consensus around the agreement that this was a likely to be material topic, which actually ranked 4th out of the 10 issues that I mentioned to you earlier that make up the standard. On the financial side, there is research to show the potential financial impact to companies based on the potential for emerging regulation to render certain types of hydrocarbon reserves as potentially unburnable, which may require a write-down of the valuation of those assets. So combining these two factors, this issue was considered as likely to be material for the industry, and that led to its inclusion in the standard. So now that we've seen kind of the details of how the topics were selected for inclusion in the standard, let's take a closer look at the different types of disclosure that you can find in current regulatory filings. So this specific example, again looking at the oil and gas exploration and production industry, is specifically looking at current state of disclosure for greenhouse gas emissions. So on the left-hand side, you see an industry-specific narrative, and this describes the company's specific response to the risk presented by this topic, but it doesn't include any quantitative indicators of performance. So in this case, the company is disclosing that it may be required to make additional capital expenditures to meet emerging greenhouse gas regulation. In the middle, you can see an example of the use of metrics. So the company here has disclosed specific performance with respect to a reduction in emissions, and has also included a range of prices for carbon emissions, which it considers in its capital investment or operational decision making. So while this is a good quantitative measurement, the disclosure isn't standardized. So if we were to compare to another company's filing, we might see, again, the use of metrics, but possibly reporting to a different basis or different considerations that go into the preparation of those numbers. And that makes them difficult to compare for investors and for companies. So on the right-hand side, you see the SASB standard and the metrics that it recommends to be reported to specifically for this topic. And so we kind of believe that the advantage of the standardized reporting is that it makes the reported information comparable and therefore decision useful. And this can be a benefit to investors seeking to understand their exposure to the risks associated with this topic, as well as to companies seeking to understand their performance on this topic relative to their peers. So now I just wanted to present kind of a specific example to make this more tangible of how a topic from one of SASB's industry standards actually impacted a company's financial performance. So in this case, we'll turn to the metals and mining industry and take a look at Kinross Gold. So earlier this year, Kinross Gold was forced to halt operations at its Maricunga mine, gold mine in Chile, due to a judicial decision to enforce a ruling by the country's environmental authority claiming irreparable environmental damage that had resulted from its mining operations there. So specifically, the regulatory agency alleged that the company's water use in its mining operations had dried up a significant area of wetlands in the area, and its subsequent restriction on access to water that it applied to the mine basically rendered the mine inoperable because the amount of water that it was allowed to access was below the minimum requirement to continue operations at the mine. So here you'll see SASB's standard for the metals and mining industry includes a topic for water management, and it specifically recommends disclosure of freshwater usage, the percentage recycled, and the percentage extracted from areas characterized by high water stress. And looking at the area where this mine was located, it was actually an area that had been subjected to drought conditions for several years, and so it would have been classified as an area of high baseline water stress. So looking a little more at what data might be available to an investor or to companies around this particular topic, here I've presented the freshwater usage for several major metals and mining companies in thousands of cubic meters per year. And this data was taken from corporate sustainability reports. And the difficulty in preparing this slide was that often the reporting tends to be on a different basis, so you have to do some interpretation to try to present the data on a comparative basis. For example, what is considered as fresh water, what are the withdrawal sources, whether it's surface, ground, rainwater, and that makes it difficult to compare. But assuming we can compare this data, you'll see that Kinross on the far right is actually one of the smallest water users. Of course, that's in aggregate, and it doesn't present to you the size of their business, relatively speaking. And it also doesn't highlight the specific risk to the Maricunga mine that was mentioned. So to close this gap, SASB standard answers several key questions. Specifically, what amount of water was withdrawn from areas that are characterized by high water stress, and what percentage of total water use is recycled. And that kind of speaks to the efficiency of a given company as it relates to its use of water in its operations, and the extent to which that efficiency can be considered as a mitigative factor for risks associated with this topic. So next I'd like to speak a little bit about our consultation process, and specifically the hypothesis for change that's being developed for the sector. So we're currently in our consultation phase and reaching out to the investment and corporate community to seek feedback on our provisional standards. As part of that process, all of the sector analysts, including myself, are preparing a document called a hypothesis for change, which includes proposed changes to the existing standards, seeking to improve their materiality, decision usefulness, and cost effectiveness. So to present one specific example of a potential change that we're considering that will be in the hypothesis for change, we're looking at a change that relates to the oil and gas midstream industry. And this proposes to add a topic and an associated metric related to the management of the rights of indigenous peoples. So as many folks on the phone may be familiar with, there's been quite a bit of news recently regarding the events surrounding the Dakota Access Pipeline. But there's also been several other examples of pipeline infrastructure projects which have been impacted by this topic, including it was an element of Keystone XL, Northern Gateway, and Energy East in Canada, for example. So this proposed metric will communicate the potential exposure of a company's pipeline projects to this risk, as well as the company's strategy to manage this risk throughout its project execution phase. And that can help differentiate companies in terms of their potential exposure to risks such as this one. So now I'd like to hand it back to Himani to take us through the next steps and what you can expect from SASB over the coming months.
Thank you, David. David, that was great. So I'll be talking about what David started talking about, which is our hypothesis for change and the next steps in our standards development process. So earlier this year, we finished standards for 79 industries across 10 sectors. And before the standards are ready for use by the market, we want to make certain changes to them to improve their decision usefulness and cost effectiveness. So that's the process we're in currently. And if we go to the next slide. Earlier this year, we also put forward proposed changes to our governance structure, and some key aspects of that relate to setting up our Standards Council in a way in which it can vote on the changes to the standards and any updates made to the standards going forward. So the Standards Council would be an independent body of experts appointed by our Board of Directors, and our Board of Directors is currently discussing the changes to be made to our governance structure. Another key aspect of the changes is likely to be the setting up of a Standards Oversight Committee, which would be a subcommittee of the board, and would hear any appeals around due process and make sure that SASB is following due process in developing its standards. There are certain other governance changes. We had put forward the proposed changes to a public comment period, a 90-day comment period, and the board is discussing the responses received and what changes we will be making. We will likely announce them in February or March of 2017. So that's our governance structure, but in terms of operations, what we're focusing on currently is an agenda or a hypothesis for change. So as David gave you one example of that, where we looked at one industry, based on developments following our provisional standards and any stakeholder feedback we received following the release of the provisional standards, we're proposing certain changes to those standards. So again, the focus is on testing the materiality of the topics we've selected, the decision usefulness of the topics and metrics, and the cost effectiveness and feasibility of implementation of the standards. We've been fortunate to have had a large group of stakeholders, including companies and investors and subject matter experts, participate in our process thus far in releasing provisional standards. But we know that we didn't include everyone in the process in the beginning. It was not possible to do so. So this is an opportunity now for us to expand our reach to companies, investors, and others to provide further input on our standards. So with that, we welcome all of you to provide us with feedback on this sector as well as on other sectors. You can connect with the individual sector analysts or with me or the head of our standard setting organization as well. So what will happen over the next couple of months until the end of March is that we will set up meetings with different stakeholders on the proposed changes, the changes we're proposing in our hypothesis for change. And we're also open to any other feedback on our standards that may not be in that hypothesis. We'll aggregate all the feedback we receive in the next few months, and in Q2 of next year, 2017, we'll put forward updates to the provisional standards such that we'll put them forward for a 90-day public comment period and invite broader participation and input on those changes to the standards. And by the end of next year, Q3, Q4 of 2017, our standards will be considered codified based on those changes. Following codification, the standards are ready for use by companies. Of course, they could be used even today, but they are in a provisional, they're under a provisional label currently. And then going forward, we'll continue to monitor issues as they evolve and new measurement methods, and we'll make updates to the standards as necessary over potentially a 3-year cycle. In doing this, or in conducting this process of consultation and in our approach focusing on material information that's relevant to investors, we've been fortunate to have the support of a broad group of investors. So earlier this month, actually, we launched our investor advisory group, which consists of the organizations you see on the slide here, as well as we're continuing to add other organizations. These are chief investment officers from these companies, and we have asset owners and managers. We have scalpers, scalpsters, BlackRock, State Street, Goldman Sachs, and others on this advisory group. So the Investor Advisory Group supports SASB's approach to standards development and calls for standardized disclosure of sustainability information. And they will, of course, be also providing input on our standards. We also have for companies to start considering SASB standards and considering their implementation, we also have advisory partners shown on this slide here. You can feel free to reach out to any of these companies. They have information from us that could help companies to implement SASB standards. SASB wouldn't directly engage in that kind of consultation. Together with our advisory partners, we also have a comprehensive system of support for companies as well as investors. We have an implementation guide, which is a document that outlines the process of how sustainability information could be reported and incorporated in 10K reporting processes. So that's a useful starting point. We also have research briefs that outline the evidence underlying the standards. So all the evidence of financial impact that we've collected for the topics that are included in the standards. We just launched the SASB Navigator, so you can also access all of that research from the Navigator, which lets you interact with the standards in a much more in an easier way. And we will also be announcing shortly the launch of a SASB library, where you'll find all of our publications related to the standards or their use or use by integration by investors as well. So with that, we'd like to open it up for Q&A. I think we have a couple of questions coming in, but please feel free to continue typing in questions. We're happy to answer them now. So the first question is related to something you talked about earlier, David. And how do you say that, SASB, how do we interpret the Dakota Access Pipeline controversy? How do we interpret that in our standard setting process?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So basically, I think this is very well exemplified by the hypothesis for change in consultation process. This is something that's been raised to us in some of our discussions with our stakeholders as an issue that is important to them. So that basically initiated us to conduct our own internal research to understand the evidence of financial impact that might exist for this topic, which led to some of the examples that I spoke about earlier. And then in order to ensure we have broad stakeholder feedback on this specific topic, that's why we're including it in our hypothesis for change, and that we're going to go out to industry, to our stakeholders, both in industry and in the investment side, to understand the extent to which this represents an issue that is likely to be material for companies specifically in the midstream area. So that generally kind of summarizes our approach and gives an example of how one particular emerging topic has made its way into consideration for inclusion in the final codified version of the standards.
Thank you, David. So we also have another question coming here, and that's, should we look at the insurance premium paid by companies to insure operations, assets, and key executives, which would also be an indicator of risk?
That's an excellent point, and absolutely that's one facet of a company's financial performance that we do consider in terms of the cost of their operation that may be impacted by their performance on these particular sustainability topics. So that is something in our research that you'll see cited as potential evidence of financial impact when we're looking at these specific sustainability topics. So yeah, absolutely very good point, and something we look at.
Thank you. So we have another question here. It's fairly long, so I'm going to try to summarize it. But basically, the question relates to requirements around climate disclosure in the U.S. investment markets. And it's also the disclosure is being strongly encouraged in countries listing on stock exchanges like Singapore Stock Exchange. But in the U.S., it's seen as still voluntary, according to the question. So please, can you comment on any known obligation that would legally dictate a responsibility to disclose material financial interests when perhaps enough risk-related factors are known affecting the climate? So there's information around how climate change, broadly speaking, might be affecting risks and financial value of companies. Is there a legal obligation to disclose that?
Sure. I mean, that's an excellent question, and SASB's approach is very much in line with, as Himani said, basically existing securities law, which looks at the Supreme Court definition for materiality. And basically where a company identifies climate change regulation or any other sustainability topic as likely to have a material financial impact on their business, SASB is providing a standardized way to report performance on that topic so that it can be well understood by the market. And I think one area where there's some challenge here is that because the disclosure on this topic tends to vary widely, it's difficult for companies to know and investors to be assured that the information that they're getting is accurately describing the risk in a comparable and decision-useful way. So we're not really seeking to deviate at all from the existing securities law and what needs to be disclosed by companies. We're really just trying to offer a standardized, effective way to report that information.
Great, thanks, David. Yeah, and that's true of all the topics that we cover. We are looking at the legal definition of materiality in the U.S., what companies are already required under securities law to disclose, and that's their legal obligation. We're providing a voluntary basis on which to do that in a decision-useful manner for investors. A couple of other questions coming in. There's a request for a clarification on the consultation process, and I apologize it wasn't fully clear. But so what we're doing now is we're open to consultation, where we are encouraging one-on-one meetings or phone calls to really debate and discuss the issues and the proposed changes to our standards and get feedback from investors, from companies, as well as from subject matter experts. So this will happen through conversations that we'll set up over this period until the end of March of 2017. There is no sort of set number of people we'll be talking to or certain types of people we'll be talking to. We're open to feedback. We just want that to be a bit more in-depth and face-to-face rather than through a letter. So that would be what would happen over the next few months, and the way to connect to us or to give us that input is to contact each of our sector analysts. We'd be happy to send around that information after the webinar, and also you can find that online on our website. On the Engage page, you'll find a way to connect with us, each of the sector analysts. They're also always, they're available on social media, so you can also feel free to connect with them on LinkedIn or follow them on Twitter. So that would be a process where we gather this input and document it over the next few months until the end of March. And based on this input we received during this period, we will then propose an agenda for change to the standards. So that agenda, the changes themselves, will be put forward to a 90-day public comment period in Q2 of 2017. And the purpose of that, in addition to this consultation, is to reach a broader group of people, broader group of stakeholders that may still have further feedback for us. But by that stage, we hope, because we've had such in-depth conversations in the preceding months, that by then we would not receive public comments that would significantly change the changes. But we're open to any feedback at that stage as well. So that will happen in Q2 of next year. That's the proposed timeline. And then Q3 of next year, we will look at all the public comments we've received, any engagements we've had since then, and then finalize the changes. So that will be then the provisional standards updated version, and that's the code that will be the SASB code. I hope I've explained that. It's a little bit of a fluid process. The formal comment period, again, is Q2 of 2017. This period right now is more consultative. We want to have phone calls and meetings. We will still document and summarize the discussions we are having now when we put forward the changes to public comment. We won't be putting up all the details and the notes of the conversation. You can also choose to provide input anonymously if you want that. We'll just be summarizing what we've heard from stakeholders when we put forward the changes for public comment.
And the only thing I'll just add to that is that's basically what my priority is for the next several months. So I just encourage you, as Himani mentioned, get in touch with me. We understand that there's different levels of familiarity with SASB among different marketplace participants, and we're happy to engage with you wherever you are in your engagement with us, provide whatever information you need to ensure that you can contribute effectively to our consultation period if you would like to participate, which we greatly encourage you to do.
Great, and we have one more question. So I'll read it out. SASB standards key off the materiality standards in U.S. law regarding disclosure and suggest quantitative metrics for various issues. Have you had any feedback from the SEC on whether such quantitative disclosures would, in their view, be required under existing disclosure rules?
Well, I don't speak with the SEC on a regular basis, but Imani might be able to speak to that one a little better than I can.
Sure, I'll try to answer that. So we've been, over the existence of SASB, regularly updating the SEC on our standards development process. Of course, in our board of directors, we have the former chair of the SEC, Mary Shapiro, who's the vice chair of SASB's board of directors now. And we have a couple of other former SEC commissioners as well. So we have the expertise from the SEC in terms of people who've worked there previously. We also have legal expertise on our board of directors. So, and nothing we're doing is sort of contrary to U.S. securities laws. Again, our disclosures, the quantitative disclosures we're proposing, companies can choose to report them or not. This is definitely quantitative disclosures are definitely something that would be more useful to investors, just like they have quantitative financial information by which they can compare companies. Of course, all of that quantitative information needs context and needs sort of a discussion and analysis. But there is, a degree of decision usefulness that's currently missing from disclosures in the 10K around sustainability issues. So that's all that we're encouraging. I won't be able to comment on the formal SEC view on quantitative disclosures, but just to say that we do have that expertise on our board of directors to guide us on that. Any other questions? Okay, we have another question here. So you also spoke about this issue earlier, David, around reserve valuation. So what are our thoughts on the ExxonMobil reserve valuation right now?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a good question. So that's a very complicated issue. I'm specifically referring to, I think, ExxonMobil's reserves valuation right down in its recent quarterly report as it relates to some assets that it has up in Canada in the oil sands projects. And it's important to note that that particular disclosure doesn't necessarily indicate that it has anything to do with climate change. Obviously, those assets are a lot more expensive to produce and may not be economic in the current price environment or the projections that Exxon's considering for oil prices going forward. However, it is an important topic that SASB has identified, specifically how future demand for hydrocarbon may be impacted by scenarios that seek to limit the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide in an effort to combat global warming or climate change. And so SASB takes a very structured approach to how we recommend disclosure around that topic, because it can be a very difficult topic to quantify. So we've leveraged existing efforts and frameworks to look at this particular topic. And our standard refers to specific scenarios, for example, the current and new policy scenario, as well as the 450 ppm scenario, that are well understood and well defined to give a good basis, technical basis for how disclosure around that particular topic can be completed by companies. And I encourage you to take a look at that particular topic in our standard, and if there are additional questions about what that might look like, that's obviously something that we'd be very interested to speak with companies and investors about in our consultation phase.
And just to add to that, of course, we also acknowledge that the topic might manifest differently for different companies that have different quality of reserves, correct?
Absolutely.
It could be gas reserves might be potentially affected less than, say, oil sands.
Exactly.
Great. So another question here is any comments or insights about the SEC reversing its nascent regulation SK process because of the president-elect's opposition? So just for context, the regulation SK process referred to here is a concept release that the SEC put forward earlier this year, asking investors and others around sustainability. Well, the concept release was a broader set of questions around regulation SK, but a component of that was asking about sustainability disclosures and whether they should be reported and improved in the 10K and set of questions around those disclosures. So David, your thoughts?
That's a very good question, and it's obviously something that we as a standard-setting organization for sustainability information, we don't have a whole lot more access to information on how the SEC might respond to that than anyone else. Well, I guess what I will say is that our approach has always been that our standards are developed to adhere to existing securities law. So, and I know we've touched on this before, but basically we're not trying to change the current definition of materiality. We're just trying to take topics that are likely to be material for companies and offer companies a way to report that information in a consistent and standardized way where those topics are identified by the company as being material to their business. Himani, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
No, that's perfect. So we did submit a comment letter to the SEC putting forward our position. Of course, it would be great if the SEC acknowledged SASB as the framework to use for companies to report sustainability information in the 10K. But the standards have been designed and developed such that any new ruling or new regulation is not required from the SEC. We are looking at existing definitions and guidance from the U.S. Supreme Court and the SEC on what should be included in the 10K. So do we have any other questions? I don't see any currently, but please do feel free to still ask any questions. We have 10 more minutes. Otherwise, we'll be wrapping up now. All right, thank you very much. You have David's information here. Please feel free to reach out to him with any questions and also to set up any conversations for feedback on our standards. We will be sending around a recording of the webinar after this, so you can get access to any of the information again. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining.